Well, thanks for joining us today. I think we have to say sorry straight away because we're overdue. And that's because I wanted to have a rant about something and we quickly had to add an extra slide in because a few things have bugged me recently which I want to talk about. Now, Luis is meant to tease me instantly about the fact I haven't shaved today, so I apologise. It's not a midlife crisis, bear with me. It's a spring thing, isn't it, Luis?
It's meant to be the fashionable 2-day stubble, but I don't know how it converts on camera.
Probably not very well, mate, not very well. Thanks for joining us again. We've got a fairly busy hour to spend together. We've got a fairly large agenda. Want to talk about sort of the HR side to begin with, moving really to the back end, some more the sort of technical, legal side if we can. I might hit the first part a little heavier than you, and I might hand over to you a little bit more as we go on. As always, send your questions through. Lewis has got the pad in front of him, and as questions come up, if we've got a chance to feed them in, we'll deal with them. And as always, if we've got a bit of time at the end, we'll get to your questions, which will be good. Why invest in performance management? Look, at the end of the day, it takes a lot of effort and energy, and also it comes at some cost to bring people into your organisation. So you obviously want to get the best out of them. And the key to that is to making sure that you cover the performance management field, both the positive and the negative, in the most effective way possible. I don't need to tell you that. I think the fact that you're listening in means you understand that already. Now, Lewis has been very generous. He's going to let me have a little bit of a rant for a while because we've been working with some clients recently. And I just wanted to make 4 observations which are really targeted at HR people more than line managers. And in no particular order. Lewis is sort of looking at the slides going, I wonder what he's going to talk about. The first one is this, if I can start with the cultural part. I've been working recently with a lot of clients around the re-articulation of their cultural values. And as you know, Lou, these normally are represented by 3 or 4 key words or key statements. And it's increasingly important that when you do re-articulate those values, that you're able to very clearly translate those into desired behaviours. I see a lot of disjunct between the cultural values and then talking to people about what behaviours they should actually be demonstrating in the workplace. And I'm a big fan at the moment of underneath each value identifying some key behavioural statements in terms of, to demonstrate this value, this is what we expect to see. And I think if you don't get that right, you're actually starting to struggle with the performance management piece right from the very beginning. So that was number one I wanted to say.
I'm going to butt in here already, which wasn't in the program. But the reason values and specifying behaviours are so important is when we get to the nitty-gritty later on and you start talking about whether someone's meeting certain criteria or whether they're not quite doing the things the way we want them to do. Sometimes a lot of this stuff you can't necessarily predict, and sometimes what you're really seeing in employees that they might not exhibit behaviours or just conduct that you consider to be generally consistent with the organisation. Yeah. And if you haven't set out at a high level, and it's necessarily high level sometimes about whether it's behaving with courtesy and respect or otherwise, if you haven't set out these kind of high level expectations that you can kind of go back to as the foundations for the relationship, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, you didn't do A, B and C. Well, where does it say I've got to do that? It might not say that anywhere, but there's certain behavioural expectations that underpin the whole organisation, and so that's why you do need them as a foundation stone.
So the cultural values, it's not just a fuzzy HR thing. It's actually the foundation for actually how people will perform in the organisation. So that's number one. The second one, which has come up a lot in a couple of projects I've worked on recently, is this whole question about alignment. I've recently started to get line managers across an organisation in a room and have very involved conversations about what behaviour is acceptable, isn't acceptable, to make sure that they actually think and exercise judgment in the same way. Because more often than not, if you come to, say, the nasty end, which is, say, unfair dismissals, lack of alignment can sometimes really bring you undone, where part of a company takes a particular approach, another part of the company doesn't take that approach. So alignment's one of the things that's been really on my agenda recently with companies. And I wanted to talk about 2 others, which is just an issue which perennially comes up when I'm working with business. One is the Monday supervisor. And I have a great deal of sympathy for the Monday supervisor. Bob's on the shop floor, or Mary's on the shop floor on Friday, has the weekend off and comes back as the supervisor on Monday. And all I'm going to say about that is that you really have to be realistic in how competent that person is in managing people if on Friday they were on the shop floor and on Monday they become a supervisor. In my experience, not yours, but in my experience, to actually turn somebody into a good people manager supervisor, it's 18 months to 3 years of pretty hard graft, trial and error experience. So I'm very sensitive at the moment about don't beat up the Monday supervisor, improve how you actually recruit and train your supervisors over a long period. And the last one is an issue I came up with recently, which was, I call it the easier said than done manager. I've met a lot of senior executives recently who've never ever had to terminate anybody in their life, but they're constantly managing people, requiring them to terminate employees or to manage difficult performance of employees. And one of the things I would urge the HR people who are listening today to think about is if you're dealing with a manager who has never done it before, but they need to actually manage people who are doing it, just keep an eye on their judgment. Because what I'm tending to find these days is that their judgment is a little bit off. That is, they're either a little too lenient or a little too draconian. They don't seem to be very balanced all of the time. So, look, I just wanted to, if you were indulging me, I know, but I just wanted to get those 4 things out of the way because I've been seeing them recently with a lot of clients. So let's crack on to some foundations. And as Luis said, if you get things wrong at the beginning, you get things terribly wrong at the end. Foundation number 1 is job clarity. If you walk up to an employee and you're able to say to the employee, tell me what your job entails, tell me what you're required to do in your job, then performance management's a lot easier. When you walk up to an employee and you say, well, tell me what you're meant to be doing in your job, and the answer is, well, look, I think it's this, I think it's that, performance management is going to be difficult from day one. So foundation 1, essentially, is make sure your employees have job clarity.
And Nigel, one of the things that arises here is what role position descriptions have to play. And I mean, we were asked this by a client recently, should I have position descriptions? And there might not be a short answer to that, but the reality is they can be extremely useful because if they're appropriately drafted, they can set out 2 types of things. At a high level, again, certain behaviours, certain overarching goals attached to the role that you expect someone to achieve. And then you might also have, at a more specific granular level, particular day-to-day tasks that are going to be quite common. If it's set up correctly, it can actually really help with someone understanding their role. If it's not set up correctly and you're too granular and too narrow in the focus, you start to get people saying, well, that's not my job.
That's not my job.
And all of a sudden the PD becomes a bit of a rod for the employer's back. So I think when you're talking about position descriptions, they are a useful tool, but right at the outset, you should again have high-level goals that the person should be trying to achieve for the organisation that are of a more generalised, higher-level nature. And then you feed into, but commonly these will be achieved through these types of specific activities, including A, B and C, but not limited to these necessarily. That type of thing can help, particularly at some of the lower levels. The more senior you get, I really think, what's required of a CFO, a COO, CEO, it really is whatever the organisation needs on a day-to-day basis in many
once you've
respects.
articulated some key accountabilities, they'll get on with the job.
Yeah.
Like I do with you. So job clarity, number 1. Number 2, very important foundation is delegation. People really need to understand what authority they have to make certain decisions or not make decisions in an organisation. I personally see delegation as liberating, not constraining. That is, I'm free to make these decisions. After that, I have to share the burden with somebody else. I think that's great. I know sometimes I meet people in business who go, oh, I can only do this or I can only do that. I think you're looking at it the wrong way if you're looking that way. But it's really important very early on people understand their delegation. Third one is, and I think you've touched on this as well, you've got to get expectations right. Very, very early on in the employment relationship, make sure that people understand what is expected of them. That is outcomes focused. That is, what are the general outcomes you want them to achieve in terms of the tasks they perform. But as Lou said very early on, understand what the expectations are on behaviour. That behaviour might be what language you can and can't use in the office. That behaviour might be about punctuality. It might be about courtesy. It might be respect. It's really important. Foundation number 3, set the expectations very, very early. And the 4th one really is the boundary one. And it gets back to that alignment concept I said earlier. What sort of behaviour is tolerable, not tolerable? If you walked into our office, you think I'm sometimes a little too liberal in our office. We've got people who've got Star Trek toys in their office and some movie posters, and I'm pretty relaxed about people expressing themselves in a professional office. In a different environment, might be a boundary people are uncomfortable with. But setting boundaries about what you can and can't do, can and can't say is really important.
And I think one of the things you need to be conscious of is if someone has overstepped the mark and you think something quite flagrant in terms of breach has gone on, you do need to think back to, or has this arisen because we haven't set the appropriate discussions to begin with? Is it this employee has absolutely done the wrong thing and should be facing very firm disciplinary sanctions, or is it that we have somehow contributed to this? And you need to understand that backdrop. Now, if you actually have set the boundaries and they knew about that, that reinforces the need to respond pretty firmly. But you might find it's a deficiency within your own organisation and you need to take that into account.
Yeah, and I've got a very strong view. Boundaries need to be overt, not covert. More often than not, you'll often see a senior manager will say, oh, they should know they shouldn't do that, or they should know they shouldn't say that. And I'll often say, well, how should they know that? And the answer becomes very vague all of a sudden. So you really need to make sure that those boundaries are very much.
And when we get to the latter part of the discussion, the Fair Work Commission's going to have the same question.
As well, yeah,
they're not going to say, oh, really, should they have known that?
Yeah.
Where did you tell them?
Where did you tell them? Absolutely right. And maybe two more things on foundations, if I can, mate. One is about onboarding. And it's a rule I still apply even to this day after quite a few years in sort of business. There's three critical moments in onboarding an employee: day one, week two, and month six. And the bottom line is this, is that if you actually look at some of the research on how people fragment, so I've just accepted the offer, I'm very excited to come and join you, you can actually start to lose me from day one. And most people make decisions to stay or go over the first 18 months to 2 years. And in fact, a lot of people's high turnover is in the first 2 years. It's not just a generational thing either. On day one, that person needs to feel very welcome. And I always say this, on day one, they need to walk in. Let's say they've got an office. Their office needs to be set up. The desk needs to be ready to go. The technology needs to be ready to be used. You don't want a situation where somebody says, oh, you'll get your computer in 4 days' time. You need to have them fixed up onto the email system on day one. And I'm a big fan of who's going to be their best friend at little lunch. Kindergartens do this really well. You know, Luis, you're going to be Nigel's best friend at little lunch today. Make sure that somebody is actually looking after them at a personal level on day one. By week two, that person should actually understand all of your business systems. How does the email work? How do I log on to your intranet? How do I do this? How do I do that? And if you make sure you've knocked that over in the first 2 weeks, you'll probably have a fairly engaged, you'll have a fairly happy employee. The check-in point is critical. Put probation aside for a minute, which I'm going to come to. The check-in point is critical is around month 6. And I always think that if you're going to have people with you after month 6, you should have a little bit of a celebration about the fact they're still with you. I'd personally like to take our new staff out around month 6 for a lunch and have a chat to them, just see how they're going. But when you think about onboarding, think day 1, week 2, and month 6, and you'll get it right. If you don't think about anything in terms of onboarding, you possibly are losing people before they even really start. And that gets me to my last foundation, which is probation. And I know some people sometimes think I'm a bit harsh when I say this, but for people who are covered by unfair dismissal laws, which Lou will get to at the back end of today, you've got a get out of jail free moment for the first 6 months, for most people. Small business a little bit different again, but I always tend to take the view that when you get to that 6 month mark, prove to me they should stay rather than prove to me they should go. And I often say to companies, if nobody can prove they should stay, the default should be goodbye. Because once you get past that get out of jail free moment, it becomes hard sometimes to actually get somebody out who's not working. Yep. And so you really don't want to waste that opportunity for the get out of free.
And I've probably got 3 bugbears in relation to that to rattle off. The first, just feeding off what Nigel just said, is it almost inherently becomes more difficult because if you've confirmed their employment at the 6 month mark, you haven't terminated during probation, and you are covered by unfair dismissal laws. There's almost a sense of, well, I was obviously going fine at the 6-month point. You said, yes, we've confirmed, you've passed your probationary period, and all of a sudden 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later you're telling me there's a problem. That's come as a shock to me, and all of a sudden the level of notice required and the level of time to rectify certain issues might need to be greater because an expectation might have been delivered or inferred that they were going okay. The other two things about the probationary period is we get a lot of questions about whether that 6-month mark is malleable in some way, whether we have a contract that says 3 months.
3 months.
Does that mean it's a 3-month period? Or can we extend? A lot of people seem to be fans of extending the probationary period. If they're not happy with an employee's performance, rather than terminating, they think that saying, we'll give you another 3 or 6 months is a softer and more lenient option. There's not many things that are black and white in law. Almost everything is grey but this. The reality is, for unfair dismissal laws, the 6-month mark is black and white in the sense that if you employ more than 15 employees, you cannot have an unfair dismissal claim brought in that first 6 months. Doesn't matter what the contract says, doesn't matter whether any other factor intervenes, claims cannot be brought in the first 6 months in relation to unfair dismissal. So that get out of jail free card that Nigel was talking about, it's absolute, but it's also absolutely lost. If you extend for a further 3 months after the probation ends, it's gone. And even though you thought you were you made it clear that you were just going to give a bit more time, that opportunity is lost forever. The probation cannot be extended beyond 6 months. It's black and white.
Yeah. So look, really adopt that prove to stay rather than prove to go. And I think it sounds a little harsh, but if you start adopting that approach, you'll actually make less bad decisions along the way in terms of the people who stay in your business and perform. So look, two distinct, so foundations really important. You've got to get those right. Two distinct sides to the performance management coin. There's the reinforcing the positive stuff, and then there's the remedial stuff. Both could be reactive, both could be systemic. I'm not going to get in today into sort of annual performance review cycles. I think we could probably do a webcast all on our own on that and objective setting. In fact, one day we probably should do that. We should do that. So let's just talk first of all about the positive stuff and really some important sort of key things to always have in the back of your mind. We seem, when we talk about performance management, almost naturally to think about the negative, about, Mary's not performing, what do we do with Mary? And I would beg you, don't lose sight of the positive reinforcing side as well, because you need both.
And if I can just say something on that, Nigel, the reality is that lots of managers spend so much time on someone who's underperforming.
Yeah.
That you have to think, what about the person that is doing a good job over there? They're not getting as much attention. Oh, we don't need to deal with Bob or Jane because they're doing a great job. But if you're not focusing on them and giving them at least close to some amount of attention comparable to all the energies that are going on over here, they tend to sometimes get disengaged.
Yeah.
And you need to focus on the fact that, yes, you will spend a lot of time with the underperformers, but are you spending any with the overperformer? What are you doing to keep them at that other level? And that's something that constantly needs to be thought about.
I agree entirely. And look, the first place to start is learn to give ad-hoc positive feedback. You have to do this in a way that's entirely authentic and genuine. It's a skill that has to be practiced. If you don't do it very often, it sounds clunky, it sounds artificial. But think your way through it. The rules, it's got to be specific, it's got to be immediate, it has to be personal. Explain how you feel from what you're observing, and it's got to be spontaneous. And try and avoid the cliches. You're a good team player, things like that. Try and avoid the cliches. But I'm very important to try and catch people doing good things and explain to them that you're grateful, that you're thankful, that you're acknowledging it. Far more if I could get people to invest in doing this, particularly in blue-collar work environments, the place would be a lot better. But go out when you finish seeing us today, go and practice doing some ad hoc positive feedback and see how you go with it. And I'd say make it your task for the next 3 or 4 weeks to actually concentrate on doing this more and more and more and getting it down pat.
Yeah, and look, a couple of things on that. There might be the odd person that just has this as an innate characteristic that they do every day, but they are few and far between.
They are.
And I find, even personally speaking, that it's something
And you're a pretty personable guy as well.
But that doesn't make you good at necessarily
No.
focusing every day to day. And I think the difficulty is, unless you deliberately turn your mind to it and actually think, have I done this today? Have I gone and reinforced someone's positive behaviours or work today or this week? It just, times get so busy, it just falls to the wayside. And so you actually have to, for most people, myself included, deliberately think about it.
Yeah.
And unless you are doing this deliberately, you're probably not doing it either at all or not as enough as you should be.
I agree entirely. There's also then structured positive feedback. I don't want to go into this in great detail, but I'm a bit of a fan at the moment that, if you've got an annual review or a twice yearly review, I'm a bit of a fan of making sure that at any given time people understand where they are and how they're going. And so I tend to think that every conversation you have with an employee is an opportunity to actually give them some form of structured positive feedback, not just the ad hoc, I've caught you doing something, but particularly when you're dealing with more professional employees, more white-collar employees, do they understand where they are at the moment in terms of their job, their career, how they're going? Every time you talk to somebody, it's an opportunity, and I don't want to lose track of that when you're actually engaging with your staff. Every conversation is an opportunity for positive, structured discussions.
Nigel, before you proceed, we do have two questions on the stuff that we've covered today. There's a straightforward one and a not so straightforward one.
A curly one.
So I think I'll take the straightforward one and I'll send you the curly one. So I'm going to go with the straightforward one first because we just finished on probation. Jill asks, can probation be extended past 6 months for unpaid leave period? And Jill, you've caught me out there on being so absolute before, because the reality is that's probably the only exception to the 6 month rule. And that is that, yes, if someone is on unpaid leave, then the 6 month period of service that constitutes that minimum period during which you can't be exposed to unfair dismissal claims, that can be extended by the period of the unpaid leave. Doesn't count if you're on workers' compensation in most jurisdictions, that period will still count. But if they're genuinely on unpaid leave, the 6 months will extend until they've had 6 months of service or paid leave. So that was the more straightforward one.
That's a good question.
Yes. So the more curly one, Nigel, Daryl asks, how do you align behaviours or practices in larger organisations with complex workforces? And I take it he's talking about there's a myriad of different people in the organisation, and how do you align those behaviours?
Well, give me a call and we'll probably talk for about an hour on it. But in very simple terms, I'm going to say this. You have to cascade it down from the top. Particularly in this country, people are more interested in what they observe rather than what they hear. So I'm going to say behaviours have to be demonstrated from the very top of the organisation, then the next level, then the next level. And as long as you've got that seamless continuation of demonstration of those behaviours, ultimately you actually get them down, use a term I use, the shop floor. If your CEO's not demonstrating them, if your executive's not demonstrating them, don't even bother passing go. So it's got to be demonstration of those behaviours rather than just words, and then it's got to be seamless from the top down so that people understand that when I look up, everybody is demonstrating that behaviour no matter where I go in the organisation. So just for a quick answer, I'd probably give that as the quick answer. Now let's flip the coin and we'll go to the negative, which is the remedial side of the conversation. You and I have talked about this now we've known each other for about 7 or 8 years, as we talked about. Look, the critical issue about when people start to underperform is you don't automatically assume that they're bad or they're evil. You really want to search, if you can, for why they're underperforming, particularly if they've been with you for quite a while and they've been a pretty decent performer or sort of even an average performer. Try and search, first of all, for why they're underperforming. Now, I do accept that every now and again in life you meet a bad egg. It's a phrase my mother used to use. She didn't call me the bad egg, but she often called my friends the bad eggs. But
you had more of them than most,
I had more of them than most, yeah. They're pretty rare to find. I mean, in a 30-year career, I've probably met 3 or 4 people who I thought were almost irredeemable, almost sort of evil in terms of how they were destructive in a workplace, but they're pretty rare to find. So really search very long and hard for why somebody who might have been doing well isn't doing well. More often than not, it'll be a pretty clear answer. And we've put on the slide sort of roughly the normal things we face. Personality clashes are quite often very real, particularly when new people are introduced into the workplace. Lack of training increasingly these days, particularly with complex jobs, is becoming an issue about underperformance. You do find very, very intelligent people, very capable people sometimes getting bored, and simply that drives underperformance. And my number one probably would be the actual culture of the workplace. As I said before, if I've got leadership, by example, very clear articulation of values equals behaviour, and I've got a good culture of performance, that is getting the job done, collaboration, you'll tend to see people won't underperform. If I've got a sticky culture, or I've got a culture where some people are not quite demonstrating the behaviours, sometimes that will be a classic place where underperformance will start to generate. So proposition number one, before we get into what do we do with that person, really try and understand first why they're underperforming.
And Nigel, just wanted to call out one other thing there. You'll see it talks about lack of fairness and in the way people treated, and this calls out an age-old problem when you deal with managing employees, which is about consistency of treatment. And the question,
hence my comment about alignment at the beginning.
That's right,
Yeah.
and it factors into the alignment discussion, which is, well, there isn't a hard and fast rule that says everyone needs to necessarily have the same treatment, perhaps even for the same piece of misconduct or the same piece of underperformance. But the difficulty is about perception. If you start to have inconsistent treatment, is there a reason why? Is there a rational basis behind it, and has that been explained? In the absence of rational explanation, inconsistency seems to automatically equate to unfairness. Because, and that's just not in performance management, it's everything in life. I, as a big supporter of the NRL, the one thing any media will automatically yell about is if one player gets 1 week banned for something instead of 2 weeks for the other, Todd Greenberg's head's on a stake on the front page of the local papers. And that's because inconsistency is just such an easy thing to target. I'm not saying you have to treat everyone exactly the same all the time in every situation, but you need a good reason if you're going to depart from that.
Yeah, and you're touching on something which is a little generational as well, which is transparency. In workplaces we work with, particularly with younger workplaces, people today actually want to know why. Why has something happened, why not? Whereas perhaps 30 years ago people were more relaxed that it is happening or when it's happening, and they didn't quite need to know why. But I think the whole, is this a fair workplace is often about, you've made a decision, but can you at least explain to me why you've made that decision? I don't necessarily want to always debate with you why, but I want the courtesy of understanding why. We do have a lot of tech companies, so startup tech companies. Everybody's under the age of 35. Being prepared to have the why conversation equals transparency. If you don't have the why conversation, you lose them fairly quickly, and they talk about it's not a very fair place to work.
Yep.
So you've got to think very long and hard about fairness is often a proxy for transparency. Look, a couple of things I probably will say, then we'll talk about process if that's all right. You really need to try and stay objective when you're dealing with negative elements of performance. More often than not, you'll often see a manager engage with an employee about these issues. The manager themselves can often feel criticised. They can feel that they're actually being challenged around their values. You see people worried about consequences. That is, if I do X with this employee, what are the consequences for me? And so one of the things I would say is that as a manager who's managing somebody who's not performing well, just try as much as you can to remove your personal emotions from the situation and what you're dealing with. Try and remove any preconceptions in terms of how you're dealing with that issue, and really try and stay balanced and objective through the process. You'll see later on, we'll talk about this, but Lewis and I often see people who end up terminating somebody's employment, and you'll see that their preconceptions have almost prejudged what they're going to do with that person before they've even undertaken any process. So number one, before you get into the negative performance management cycle, really just try and stay objective and stay balanced.
Nigel, we've just had a question come up based on what we've just been talking about personality clashes from Vinny. Vinny's particular challenge is, what are the tips if personality clashes emerge years after two workers have been together for some time? So it's not something that's happened just straight off the bat, but they've been working together well for quite some time and now they're clashing. Is there any particular tip about how you might go about that?
Well, and I might say something different to you, and I possibly will in this, but my challenge, Vinny, would be you need to decide whether or not that's a conversation you're going to have with those people individually, or whether or not you're going to use an American phrase, you're going to have an intervention and you're really going to try and get them together and get to the bottom of what the problem is. Because the issue is this: if I've worked with Luis really well for a period of time and now I'm clashing, there must be a reason. Something's motivated it. I mean, unless Luis has gone off the rails or I've gone off the rails. So in that case, what I'm trying to do is get to the nub of it and see if I can either resolve the problem, or if I can't resolve the problem, can I get people to agree to move past that problem and focus on what used to be the positives of the relationship rather than the current impediment. And structurally, I'm always going to try and make a judgment call. Do I do that with them individually? And do I go individually, I can either resolve or we move past and focus on the positive, or do I actually need to get them both in the room and try and get to the nub of it? Sometimes you get them both in the room, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and you just have to live with that. Sometimes, I'll be frank as well, sometimes personality clashes become very deep, very ego-driven, pride gets in the way, and sometimes they are not able to be resolved.
Yep.
And then it's about, well, do they both go? Am I saving one of them? Do I move them away from each other? Have I got an organisation where I can do that, particularly if otherwise they're good employees? So, look, just some general observations I'd offer Vinny.
I actually don't disagree. I wholeheartedly endorse Nigel's response. The only thing I can add is that if you do see these issues arise and actually don't do anything because you think it's too hard, it's just going to fester, and what you'll find is it probably won't go away. If you're lucky, it might. Maybe 1, 2 in 10 cases it might go away. 7 in 10 cases around about that, it's probably going to fester and then burst. And it'll burst in a number of different ways: employee misconduct, a bullying and harassment claim, a discrimination claim. Physical confrontation. It's generally not going to go away. So the sooner you can try and start dealing with it in the way Nigel suggested, the better off you're going to be.
And I'm going to agree with you as well. I think that's critical. You see a lot of managers who'll look at that situation and they'll go, oh, it'll sort itself out. Now, look, sometimes it does, and I can be accused sometimes of going, I think time will heal that. But more often than not, early intervention is really, really important. Nip it in the bud before it actually does start to involve ego, pride, positioning. Because particularly the worst thing about a personality clash in an office situation is, after a while, people take sides. Yep. And then all of a sudden, it's not about two people, it's about two factions of people, and then I've got a real problem, which I've got to unpeel. So early intervention is really a really good pickup, really important. And look, before I get on to process, just wanted to quickly say, important skills when I'm dealing with employees in difficult situations, it's really important to listen. We could do a whole segment on listening and things like that, but it's really important, very early on I said, don't prejudge when you're engaging with staff around underperformance, non-performance. Be prepared to listen. It's really important to try and demonstrate some empathy in the journey rather than just be directive. I'm very keen on people being assertive, though, about what is required, and particularly if you are able to be assertive, it's not a very Australian thing to do, but if you can learn to be assertive and explain how their conduct is making you feel or other people feel, rather than just talking about it in a kind of construct sense, actually talking about it in an emotional sense. And lastly, apropos of what we just talked about, be prepared to de-escalate when it's necessary. The last thing you want to do is to let a situation get out of control, because then I'm probably solving not the original situation, but many others. But always have in the back of your mind when you're engaging an employee about underperformance, am I listening? Am I demonstrating empathy? Am I being appropriately assertive? And if necessary, am I de-escalating? And they're the 4 really big keys. Now, we were worried this slide wasn't going to come up a little early today, but look, process should really be the same no matter what I'm dealing with. If somebody's late for work 3 days in a row, versus somebody's just had a punch up down in the amenities block. It should really be the same. And can I glide through and then you can jump? Proposition number 1 is establish the facts. We more often than not see people skip over this. John told me that Bob said, rather than actually finding out. And we use the word investigation, and investigations can be massive things, but it could be as simple as just saying, well, was that person actually late for those 3 days, and when did they actually arrive here? So proposition number 1 is you always got to investigate facts.
Yeah, absolutely. What you see there when we talk about investigating the facts, for a low-level issue, as Nigel said, you might be talking to one person. For something that's very serious, that might result in someone not coming back to the workplace, you might be talking about termination.
Like a fight.
Something like a fight. There might be safety reasons, or you might need to separate people for a reason. You might be telling some employers they're not required to present for work whilst you undergo the investigation process. If that's the case, you're probably in 99% of cases, you'll be obliged to pay them during that period. So that is, you're not requiring them to attend for work, but you're going to pay them for that period. So they're remaining employed whilst you get to the bottom of the matter.
And most of our clients would say, I'm standing you down. I'm not going to get into the debate as to whether or not that's legally right, but what they really mean is stay home until I call you, but you're going to continue to be paid.
That's right.
And the thorny question is always, do I have to pay them ordinary time, or if they normally work overtime? Our proposition is you pay them ordinary time, whatever they would normally get paid.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a question you make early on, and there's really usually only 3 grounds that you'd suspend, if we want to call it that, on full pay, and that is 1, you think it's really serious, there's a decent prospect it's going to be established and the person's not going to be coming back. You might do it for that reason. 2, the presence of the employee in the workplace might compromise the investigation process because of conversations you're concerned they might have or some other reason. And 3, there's some immediate safety concern.
Yeah.
They're probably the reasons you might require someone not to present for work during the course of the investigation.
Good point. So, look, establish the facts. You've got to put the facts in the position to the employee. Now, that can be in writing. It can be in writing followed by a meeting. In very simple cases, it might simply be, can you come and talk to me on Tuesday? You've got to allow the person an opportunity to respond. Again, in small level matters, that response probably can be immediate. Sometimes in very complex matters, it's reasonable to allow the person time to consider what's put to them. So it might be come back in 2 days. Occasionally you'll have situations where somebody actually might want to put something to you in writing. So it's just about making sure that you balance the timing of that and the fairness of that against the complexity of what's involved.
Exactly. And it's really what is a reasonable period to respond to something. I endorse Nigel's comment. For a minor performance matter, we just deal with it on the spot. But if you've got a very complex bullying matter with a whole series of factual allegations, an employee might start to claim that they're being ambushed, or they're not able to properly respond unless they can sit down and digest it all. And that's when you start talking about days, or even in a rare case, it might be up to a week.
And then of course, having heard what they've got to say, you consider their response. And again, in a simple matter, that might be instantaneous. You can consider it on the run. In a more complex matter, that might be, look, we're just going to take an hour to think about it. In very complex matters, it might be, look, we're going to spend a couple of days, talk to the HR director, the HR manager, and we'll get back to you in a couple of days. So just, again, it's got to be balanced in light of the seriousness and complexity of what you're dealing with. And then if you want to...
So, well, particularly in relation to performance, which is where we are today, you need to then proceed to what you're going to do about the issue. Now, if we stay in the performance management sphere, that really means you've made findings that whoever the employee is hasn't been hitting certain goals, hasn't been behaving the way we want, or hasn't been achieving the level of output. And then it's about, well, what are we going to do about it? In a performance context, often we're seeing more and more performance improvement plans come out. The beauty of the performance improvement plan is that it sets, or the idea is it should set, very clear types of behaviours or attributes that need to be met,
outcomes,
types of activities that should be engaged over a period of time, so that the employee knows the performance indicators, if you like, that they're meant to meet. and they'll be assessed over a period of time. Now, that may or may not be accompanied with a written warning. It depends how long we've been going down this path.
We'll come on to that.
And that's the sanction that you might be implementing in the performance context. If we're talking about disciplinary action and we're getting towards the pointy end of actual termination, at that point we'd be recommending that you actually put a preliminary view to the employer. I'm proposing to terminate your employment. Preferably in writing. My preliminary view is we're going to be terminating, and that you get their response to that. Less so in a performance context, you pretty much just say this is what we're doing and this is why. In a termination context, you're going to want to ensure that they have every opportunity to respond to the proposed sanction.
And, particularly in unfair dismissal situations, the first thing Lewis will probably say, unless it was a serious misconduct, it's fine. Do you have any performance improvement plans? And if the client says, well, we don't do those, straight away you're trying to piece together, when did you talk to them, what did you talk to them about, what did you... So the performance improvement plan is a wonderful device, actually takes pressure off the manager, because there in writing is the expectations, the time periods they've got to meet those expectations, but it's also a wonderful thing later on if it hasn't gone right and it's ended up in the person losing their job.
So I always tell HR managers that they should really have this arrow tattooed on the inside of their eyelid, because it doesn't matter, as Nigel said at the beginning, the context, always use this arrow, and we're going to come to procedural fairness in a moment, but this will put you in a very good position every time.
Now, I've taken a little bit too much time up today, so we're going to move on if that's all right. Warnings. Look, people get a little bit too caught up in this. There is no law that says you need a certain number of warnings. There's no golden rule about this. Different companies will sometimes have slightly different approaches. Some will say, well, we have 2. Some will say we have 3. So just understand, the whole purpose of the warning concept is, am I giving people sufficient time and sufficient opportunity to improve or to change my behaviour? Or ultimately, do I see an appropriate sequence of ratcheting up the importance of what's going on and, importantly, the likely consequences? So most companies we deal with have kind of got a 2 or 3 warning process that they adopt.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would just say is be very careful what you put in written policies about this. Yeah. The moment you say to employees, well, ordinarily we will give you this and then this and then this before dismissal, you set that rod for the back of the employer that will be applied by the Fair Work Commission. They will say in an unfair dismissal, well, in your policy you said that these things would take place before a dismissal. And what we often find is a manager might not have done what they should have, might not have been proactive at the beginning, and then all of a sudden want to terminate. And we're saying, but your policy says that before a termination, they'll be given at least 2 warnings, or even worse, policies we often see commit to all sorts of retraining and things like that. And we say to the employer, have you done all these things you promised to do? And often they haven't. So if you do have policies that touch on this, they need to be absolutely high level about the way in which a performance process will be conducted. The more you promise, the more you set thresholds that you have to meet yourself.
And I will, probably not the perfect time to say it, but I will say a couple of things about that. One is, before you make any decision to terminate, find out if you actually have a policy about these things and read it, please. And the other one I always say is, please get the employee's employment contract, because there's normally some good stuff in there which actually will bolster how you might articulate your decision or whatever. I'm not talking about notice now, but general obligations. So just do that if you can. But yeah, so look, just understand that there isn't, we often get asked, is there a legal requirement to do 3? The answer is there isn't, but have a fairly consistent approach in terms of what you're going to adopt. Formal counselling, I might hand over to you if we're writing warnings.
Yeah, if we're writing warnings, there's probably at least 2 critical elements, and there might be some other things that we will capture as well. The absolute fundamental, in my view, is the beginning and the end of it. The beginning is going to call out what the issue is that's arisen, what the findings were, if it's performance or conduct, these things have occurred and they're not satisfactory for these reasons. But at the bottom end of the warning, the other vital element is to make it clear that it's not just if that behaviour is repeated, because then your focus is too narrow. You should be saying something to the effect that if there are further performance or conduct issues, then further disciplinary action may ensue up to and including termination. The beauty of having that type of catch-all at the bottom is that you can then rely on that document to say, well, they were warned that they needed to really pull up their socks. And if your warning is too narrow, and it says, well,
Lewis might warn somebody for that as well, by the way.
If your warning is too narrow and it's too focused on this one issue, then someone will say, oh, well, I engaged this other behaviour, but I didn't know that that could get me in trouble as well.
We have a very famous experience that I've shared with Lewis over the years where I once had a manager ring me up and said, oh, look, David's gone, I finally got him. I said, oh, how many warnings has David got? And he said, oh, he's got 16 warnings. And I said, well, how do you get 16 warnings? And, well, he's got 2 for the hard hat, 2 for not wearing the boots, 2 for the high-vis vest, but I could never get the 3rd one, and I finally got him on 3. So just make sure that when you're writing that first paragraph, you might articulate the specifics, but the warnings in relation to their employment, not in relation specifically to the hard hat alone.
That's right. So there's a number of other matters up there which obviously commend to you, but I think those two are absolutely vital.
Front and
that's
the bottom.
right.
Yeah.
Now, if it is performance related, it is really helpful to have a review period, because one of the things that the Commission's going to look for is if someone's underperforming, the question is, have they been given a reasonable opportunity to improve upon that? And if you build that into your warning process, you're probably more likely to actively monitor that.
As you would say, the warning with the PIP is almost like the perfect way to do it.
Absolutely.
Look, decisions to terminate, we'll jump because we're going to do this a little bit later before we finish today, but you've got to have a valid reason. In other words, you can't have a spurious or non-existent reason to terminate, and then you get into debates about mitigating circumstances. But the bottom line here is this notion of, do you have a justifiable, objective reason to actually say goodbye to the person? Now, I imagine our audience are probably pretty good at unfair dismissals, but do you want to just quickly go around?
Yes. So the point of the next kind of few minutes is to explain to you the best way to kind of handle an exit to avoid unfair dismissal liability. Now, I suppose the first thing is, well, when does unfair dismissal laws, or when do they kind of apply? You've got there on your slides a brief summary of who's captured by unfair dismissal laws. The biggest and most common one is employees earning over $148,700 do not have access to unfair dismissal laws, but there is an important carve-out, and that is if someone is earning more than that $148,700, but they are still covered by an award or they're covered by an E8, they're back in. So the first thing we think about is this employee protected? If they're not, you can take a much more robust approach to the performance management, because your termination process is governed by the contract. You can always terminate with notice. It's those with unfair dismissal access that the bigger issues arise. We've talked at length about the probation period. It's 6 months for a small business, 6 months for a larger business, and 12 months for a small business, which is less than 15 employees. True casuals, which is a vexed statement, and one which deserves two webinars.
Three hours by itself.
That is casuals with genuinely sporadic, fluctuating hours, don't have regular and systematic volume of work and legitimate expectation of that ongoing work continuing. True casuals are not covered. All people on true fixed-term contracts, that is contracts you can't really terminate, but for serious misconduct until the end of their term, those employees are out. We don't see many true casuals these days. We don't see a lot of true fixed-term contracts. So you really need to take advice if you're going to take the plunge in that space.
I think that's key. Is if you've got any anxieties about are they or aren't they covered, that's when you make the phone call, because it's money well spent if you make the phone call at that stage rather than later on.
That's right. And genuine redundancy circumstances are also excluded, but you need to be very careful. To be a genuine redundancy, not only do you not need the role to be performed anymore, but you must have complied with all the consultation obligations in any award or EA that applies, and they are quite prescriptive when it comes to consultation, and you must have exhausted the opportunity to redeploy the person. Only if those elements are met do the unfair dismissal laws not apply.
Yeah, and again, when in doubt, pick up the phone, and that's a sensible thing to do at that stage.
So, and very briefly, just so people understand the true importance of handling this correctly, if you get it wrong, people can have their jobs reinstated, they can be re-employed, or they can get compensation of up to 6 months' pay.
And look, don't get stressed. If you get hit by an unfair dismissal claim, make the call, but please don't sort of panic. About 15,000 claims were made last year, give or take a few hundred. Of all of those 15,000 claims, only about 300 in the end went to a court hearing, a commission hearing, and of that, only about 50 odd people got their job back. So just be very mindful that if you do get confronted by an unfair dismissal claim, you've probably got one of two decisions to make in terms of how you defend it. One is it a matter of important principle that just has to be defended? Or let's be candid, is it a commercial decision? Is some money going to make this person simply go away? You get the outcome you want at very little expense in most cases, and you move on and you run your business successfully. So just be mindful that it's a principle issue or it's a commercial issue. We'll normally walk you through that and tell you when you should fight it and when you shouldn't.
Yep. And look, I think then when it comes to what can you do to defend these types of claims, Nigel's already mentioned needing to have a valid reason. What they are looking for is what I might term substantive fairness in the dismissal decision. So that is, was the punishment fit for the crime in terms of, is this the type of thing that's clearly a breach, a material breach of a policy? Do they clearly not have the capacity to do the job because of the underperformance pattern that's been identified? Is it misconduct that's so great that most employers probably wouldn't have trust in this person sticking around any longer? But even once you've considered that, are there significant mitigating factors that might still make the decision harsh? That's when length of service comes in. That's when
unblemished record up to that point.
Prospects of being re-employed, their family situation, if they're suffering from any medical condition at the time. You then need to consider all of those matters to come to a view as to whether is it on an overall basis harsh or unreasonable or unjust. And that kind of decision-making process really is twofold. Can we prove they've done the wrong thing or they just can't perform if we're talking about performance? And particularly in performance, we've given them multiple opportunities to rectify that. They've been on notice and it still hasn't improved. And even if that is the case, what do all the other factors kind of indicate in terms of their personal circumstances and so on and so forth? That's the first hurdle. Second hurdle then is procedural fairness. And that's when we come back to that arrow.
The policy, the arrow.
Have we complied with the policies?
Did we investigate the facts?
Did they get an opportunity to participate in the process? If you slip up on any of those elements, that's when you might have procedural unfairness infect your decision, and again, you might see a successful claim. So they are the things that you need to be thinking about, and unless you have covered off all of those matters and dealt with them sufficiently, that's when we see exposure.
Yeah, and look, and don't stress as well, because even with the best HR people, the best experienced line managers, I can tell you now, Luis and I can probably find some weakness in what you've done. So that it's not about being perfect. It's just about, can you reasonably tick off those key elements, in which case you've got a pretty defensible situation and you should be okay.
Yep. Better keep moving because there's a wave of questions coming in. So
we'll just must do. So look, set the foundations. If you don't set the foundations early, don't be surprised you don't actually have a performance culture going forward. Please make ad hoc feedback a habit. I beg you to do that. Give it a go, give it a try. Make sure you got that boundary alignment right about what people can't do, can and can't say. Tattoo that simple arrow process. Did you say eyelids or
inside of your eyelids?
Inside of your eyelids.
That way you see it when you sleep.
Okay, tattoo that process onto the inside of your eyelids. Please, if you don't have a performance improvement plan, give us a call. I think sometimes we've given them away in the past. We'll probably give it away this time as well. I'm being looked at as we'll sort that out. If you don't have a performance improvement plan, we'll send you our template. And please invest in frontline performance management capability. We do a tremendous amount of training these days with frontline supervisors. You get the best bang for buck if you're spending the money on the front line.
So I think we can probably handle a couple of questions.
Off we go.
So first one from Geary, what is the role of the support person and who cannot be a support person?
Now, we didn't cover that, I don't know.
So that's right. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
So broadly speaking, particularly in a dismissal context, if there is a meeting that might result in someone's employment being at jeopardy, if they have requested a support person that has been denied, that is a matter that will affect the
procedural fairness.
The fairness, and the Commission will take that into account. So it's very important. We generally, as a matter of best practice, just tell employers to offer people the ability to have a support person.
Now, just importantly, sometimes the support person wants to become an advocate. I'll let you talk about union officials to support people in a minute. I tend to cut people some slack when that happens, but at the end of the day, I make it very clear that I need the employee to actually respond to the questions. Now, assuming the employee is competent in terms of English language and the like, I want them to respond. So I'll normally be delicate with a support person, but making sure they understand their role is support, not advocacy. But it can get vague if it's a union official.
Well, some EAs as well might give people rights of representation, which is a different matter. But I endorse those comments because absolutely so many unfair dismissals involve elements of dishonesty, of lack of accepting responsibility for behaviours. And if they actually didn't make the statements in the meeting, an employee can disassociate themselves
with them later on.
Yeah. What about, Nigel, the expiry date of warnings, especially for conduct?
I could almost bet I could guess who's asked this question, but look, there's no rule. What I will say is look very carefully if you've got an enterprise agreement and you've actually put something in there about that. As a general rule, it goes something like this. By about 2 years, most warnings go pretty cold. Most warnings after a year will still be quite warm, but somewhere between 1 year to 2 year, the relevance. So if you're on a final warning and I'm trying to rely on the final warning 18 months after it's given, I'm probably looking pretty fragile. If I'm relying on the final warning up to, say, a year after it's given, I'm feeling pretty good. If you come to me and say, we gave them a final warning 3 years ago, I'm going to say we probably need to think again about whether or not we actually act on the fact they've misbehaved after the final warning.
And it still forms part of that general holistic record of their entire employment.
Absolutely.
And gets taken into account. But you can't be saying, well, you've breached your final warning. This was always
2 years ago and off you're going to go. So I would say up to 1 year, I'm pretty comfortable. 1 to 2, it's starting to go cold. After 2, particularly if it's a final warning, I wouldn't be getting too robust about relying on it.
What if the employee won't sign their written warning?
Don't stress about it. I don't get caught up with that because then you get into an argument about whether or not they're prepared to sign a warning. I would just make a very clear file note witnessed by somebody else that I've issued the warning, and I would leave it at that. If they won't sign the warning, you might ask them to initial a register saying they simply received it. Some people don't want to sign it because they don't want to acknowledge they've done bad. All you want to be able to prove later on is they got it.
Absolutely. It's about proving you communicated to them that what they did was not up to our expectations. You can have the argument later about whether the warning should or shouldn't have been given. Have that in the Fair Work Commission. You just need to prove they got it.
Yeah. And so often you end up, if you're trying to force somebody to sign something, you end up in a secondary argument which gets you off track.
We've probably got time for a final question. I now need to go through. Here we go. If a conduct issue...
the clock's ticking down on him.
Clock is ticking down. Must you do the cause every time? I assume that's a show cause. Must you do a show cause every time? My preference is absolutely always.
If you're thinking of moving to terminate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or always. If you're thinking of moving to terminate, you should. Very rarely. I mean, there's this notion that, there might be some conduct that's so obviously inappropriate you can summarily dismiss on the spot. If you're satisfied that absolutely it is incontrovertible and it is so flagrant that no commission member would decide that there was any element of unfairness in it, but I don't know why you would take such a robust approach. I don't think it'll serve you.
We've got to go. It's been great again. Thanks very much for being us.
Yes, there's 2 quick things that I'm instructed to tell everyone though, because so Nigel doesn't get in trouble at the end of this. One is in terms of further training we have coming up, we actually have some tailored training sessions. Firstly on workplace investigations. They're running next week.
Is Joe doing them?
I think so.
He's very good. You should go to that.
Sydney, Newcastle, or Brisbane. So absolutely look into that if you're keen to develop your knowledge in quite an in-depth session. We then have later on in October an employment law fundamentals session, which is a whole day on all the basics of employment law.
Very good for HR people.
Yes. So you can go onto our website for that. And I think that's the main stuff.
So have a great week. Thanks very much. If you want to throw in some